When I was thinking about what I would say to you today, I thought about, I've been in your shoes, I've sat where you're sitting today, and I thought about how fantastic the day is, but how it can be a little bit overwhelming. You have to take in a lot of information in a very short period of time. It's very inspiring, it's very invigorating, but it's also a little bit overwhelming. So I wanted to just leave you with one thing today. So you've only got one thing to take away from me, and that's this word, expectation. And I wanted to tell you a little story about expectation. It's actually about me, and it's not about Soph. When I was a child, my family moved around a lot, and I went to a lot of different schools, 10 at the last count. And a lot of them over the passage of time have sort of blurred into each other, but there's one school and one year in particular that kind of lives in our family history, and I remember that school and that year very clearly. Because that year I went from a little girl who was always desperate to get to school and who really enjoyed to school, to a girl who started feigning illness and wanting to stay home and started dragging the chain and didn't want to go to school. So my mum started talking to some of the other mums, and it turns out there was a lot of feigning illness going around. There was even some nightmares and some bedwetting going on. Turns out the common denominator was the teacher, who was a lovely lady called Mrs. Spong. Mrs. Spong was a woman of a certain age, and she'd been teaching a long time. And when my mum got my school report about halfway through the year, it was very markedly different from the reports that I'd got before. So she dutifully went off to see Mrs. Spong. She had her parent-teacher interview. And at the parent-teacher interview, Mrs. Spong told my mother that I was just a little butterfly, and all I did was flit from thing to thing, and I would never settle on anything. And then she uttered the immortal words, "You know, she's really never going to amount to anything." Now, 30 years later, my mum will still tell you, word for word, that story. And in fact, just the other day, we were having a conversation about something completely else, and she told me the story about Mrs. Spong again. So she needs to get over it. But what angered her was the very casual but very cruel way Mrs. Spong dismissed all the potential that she saw in her daughter every day. Now, there's two things that I find really fascinating about that little piece of family history, and the one is how I behaved according to expectation. I was a good student, in fact a very, very good student, but that year I wasn't. And Mrs. Spong had no expectations of me, and I behaved accordingly. And the second thing that I find really interesting about it is that I have had that conversation now about my own daughter many, many times as people try and dampen my expectations of what I think that Sophie can achieve. Mercifully, no one's been quite as cruel as Mrs. Spong, but I've had that conversation many times. So this is my daughter Sophie. Sophie's 14, and as Ian said, she's just started at Our Lady of Sion, and she has spent the last 7 years as a much loved class member at Doncaster Primary School. Sophie loves Our Lady of Sion just as she loved Doncaster. Sophie just loves school. She really loves learning. She's a very curious cat. At primary school, she did everything from learn the cha-cha-cha for the school ball to learn how to multiply fractions. And she did them with the same gusto. In her last year of primary school, just like all the other kids, she wanted to be considered for a leadership position. So she rehearsed a speech, made her pitch to her peers, and this is the day she was named Lawson House Vice Captain. She has already told me that she would like to be house captain at her new school. So she's already set her sights high. Sophie loves school, and she also really loves sport. She's a much valued member of our local cricket club, and she's also just started playing indoor cricket for Sion. She loves gymnastics, and she trains at the local club with her brother and her sister. She also loves anything to do with water, whether it's the pool or the beach, she's in it. Soph has a wicked sense of humour, but she is also very kind, and she's very generous. She has an incredible radar for people. She knows who is genuine with her and who is a fake, and she spots them immediately. She's also really sensitive to the emotions of people around her, and while she doesn't always understand why, she always picks up immediately when something is wrong. And even though her brother and sister, if they were here today, would give you a laundry list of all her faults, they would also acknowledge that as a sibling, she is kind and generous and very forgiving. The fights are pretty furious, but they are over really quickly, and Sophie is always the first one to forgive. And interestingly for them, she doesn't hold a grudge. So in case I haven't made myself clear, I am a very, very proud mother. I think Sophie is pretty awesome, but I really expect her to be. Sometimes when I'm talking to people, whether it's medical professionals, teachers, a group of people like today, I watch people's faces when I'm talking about Soph, and they get this very particular look on their face. And the look is, yeah, she sounds pretty exceptional. And then sometimes they're even game enough to say that out loud. And it's usually followed by, but the child I'm working with, my child, the student I'm working with, isn't capable like your daughter. So I want to tell you about another child. And let me read to you about this child. This child also has a diagnosis of Down syndrome. She also has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, obsessive compulsive behaviours, and a significant expressive language delay due to hearing loss. Her receptive and expressive language skills have been consistently documented as severely disordered. A significant difficulty with articulation is also evident, and her speech is moderately unintelligible. Her performance on her recent IQ tests suggests her inability to understand conventional standards of behaviour in common situations, or ideas familiar to most girls her age, place her at risk in unfamiliar situations. She has been assessed as having a moderate intellectual disability, not a mild intellectual disability, but a moderate intellectual disability. So who was this other child? Well, that other child was also Sophie. And these are quotes taken directly from her funding application for high school. She is all the things that I described, but she is also all of the things that the psychologist described. It's just like this very famous picture. It depends on how you see her. It depends on what you're looking at. It depends on how you choose to see her. So usually my response to those who question whether Sophie is exceptional, or whether she's just a high flyer, or whether she's just a high achiever, is that I say yes, she is a high achiever, because we expect her to be. So what are our expectations for Sophie? Well, we want her to have an adult life that is as independent as possible. We'd like her to live with a person or persons of her own choosing out in the community, and we expect that she'll need support to do so. We expect her to be employed, to have a job that she enjoys. We want her to have the chance at a meaningful long-term relationship, to continue to enjoy the company of family and friends, to make a contribution to any community that she chooses to join. We want her to live and to love and to laugh and be happy. In actual fact, our expectations for Sophie are no different from our expectations of our other two children. It's just that what we know is that her path to the achievement of those same goals will be so much harder because she has so many more hurdles that she has to tackle. There is so much standing in her way. And just as with the other children, we expect that a good education is essential to the achievement of those goals. And that's no less true of Sophie, and I can't emphasise that enough. In fact, it might even be more true of Sophie because she has so much standing in her way. So when it comes to Sophie, what my husband and I do is generally set a goal and then work backwards and work out what we need to do to achieve that goal. And so when it came to looking for a school, we were looking for a school that was going to help us achieve that independent adult life that we wanted to have. We wanted a school that would partner with us. We wanted a school that believed in Sophie the way that we believe in Sophie. And we wanted a school that was going to give her her best chance at realising her potential. And for us, that was a mainstream school. And I think if there was anybody here from Doncaster Primary School, that they would tell you that Sophie's one of their success stories. But that doesn't mean for a second that it's been easy. There have been many, many challenges along the way, like the time that Sophie climbed up onto the school roof. or the time that she came back for camp where she successfully tackled the giant ropes course. She then decided to replicate that experience up in one of the school trees and tied herself up there with skipping ropes. There was a significant part of one year where Sophie just refused point blank to go to Lote. There were many challenges along the way, but I had an expectation of the school that they would set the bar high and then help Sophie to jump over it, just as they were helping all the other kids jump over it. And I made my expectations of the school very clear, and I reiterated them every year with every new teacher. And in every PSG, I made it clear that I would rather set the goals high and just fall short of achieving them than lowball Soph and miss an opportunity for her to realise her potential. But in return, I also made it really clear about what the school could expect from me, that I would back the teacher 100% in whatever they were doing, and that I'd do everything that I could to contribute to meeting those goals, and they could rely on me to do the things that they had asked me to do. When a child's born without a disability, their lives are seen as full of promise. No one hands a mother a newborn baby and says with a sigh, you know, one day this kid's going to disappoint you. No one hands over a baby and says, you know, one day this kid could be a drug dealer. No one hands over a baby and says, you know, one day this kid could knock over a 7-Eleven. But when a child is born with a disability, that situation is reversed. And the days and the months, that years that follow, are a litany of, no, they can't really do that. No, you really shouldn't expect them to do that. And no, that's not really going to be possible. And you have round and round of very well-meaning professionals in your life who feel it is their job to adjust your expectations. But what it does is little by little chip away their promise and all of your hope. And what you have to do is fight to get it back. Because the truth is, for all our knowledge, for all our medical advances, you can't predict the life of a child with Down syndrome any more than you can predict the life of a child without Down syndrome. Because the spark that makes us what we are, makes us unpredictable. So what we should expect is the unexpected. Back in 2013, Sophie had a chance to meet the then Prime Minister Julia Gillard. It was at an event to mark the government's introduction of a promise to fund the NDIS through an increase in the Medicare levy. And a lot of people who'd been involved in the campaign for the National Disability Insurance Scheme were invited to this event. Sophie spent a lot of time with the Prime Minister that day, including, much to my mortification, sitting down in her lap when the Prime Minister sat down to have a cup of coffee. And a couple of weeks later, our whole family was invited to witness as Victoria formally signed up for the NDIS. And once again, Sophie had an opportunity to spend some more time with the Prime Minister. Now, it was a very long event and it was going on far too long. And Sophie really, really loves to take photos, and it's one of the things that we've always really encouraged for her. And so in order to keep her occupied, positively occupied, during this very long event, we gave her the camera. And so as the Prime Minister was leaving the event, she asked to take her photo. And the Prime Minister leant down and Sophie snapped off a few photos. And when we got home, my husband and I downloaded them off the camera and we found this one. And all we did was, as proud parents, got on Facebook and shared it with a few of our friends. And that photo traversed the internet and wound up in the Australian Museum of Democracy in Canberra. So a couple of months later, after Sophie took that photo, the Prime Minister stood up in Parliament and introduced the legislation that would provide for the Medicare levy increase that would fund the NDIS. And when she got to the part in her speech where she mentioned meeting Sophie, she started to cry. And her tears and her speech got quite a lot of media attention that day, and as a result, so did Sophie. And so that's how one day in May, this little girl with Down syndrome ended up on the front page of The Age. Now, over the 14 years that Sophie's been around, we've had many, many predictions of what her life was going to be like. But no one happened to mention the significant role that she would play in introducing the NDIS. That's an amazing social policy reform that is going to transform the lives of people with disability and their families around this country. No one mentioned that she would be a photographer who would snap off a photo that would go around the internet and end up in a museum. No one mentioned any of those things because no one knew. So the thing that I'd like to leave you with today is that it's really important. We don't know what we don't know. We should only just expect the unexpected. Thank you.